Good evening. My name is John Cole, and tonight I'm going to be reading a couple sections what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be reading my chapter from Behind the Power, Your Success is Waiting on You over the next 3 nights. Tonight I'm going to start with the first two sections, and then tomorrow I'll read a little more, and then finally on Tuesday night I'll finish up the book. Now, before I get reading, I just want to say a couple things. First, when you write something that's very personal, like a journal or a diary or something like that, it's meant to be kept. It's not necessarily meant to be shared. When you decide to write something that's personal and put it in written format, well, it's kind of exposing you a little bit. Maybe you're talking a little bit about your vulnerabilities, or you're giving up a little bit of your safety when you do that. And it can be a very scary thing. However, when you write something and you have it published in a book, not too many people read much anymore. So your distribution may not be as wide, perhaps, as it might have been, 10 or 20 years ago. But when you take that same story and you put it on the internet, it now becomes something that the entire world has access to immediately. So that, I have to admit, is a little bit scary. However, I think my story is important because although it's my story, I think you'll see or could see parts of yourself in my story, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to share it with you. So that's the first part. The second part is all the names in the story have been changed, okay, with the exception, of course, are mine. And the reason for that is because some of these subjects are very sensitive. I talk about some very sensitive things, and I certainly don't want to shine any negative light on anybody, because although my story gets very personal at times, um, the bottom line is I hold no ill will against anyone, including myself. I've long since forgiven myself from some of my poor behaviors when I was younger, and yes, and less wise. There we go. I could speak it. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start reading my chapter. It's entitled From Living in Pain to Thriving in Passion. The first part is called The Belt. My father's belt was made of shiny black leather with a large silver buckle. Although I don't remember the first time he used it on me, the sound he made with it before he hit me was terrifying. He would fold it in half, grab both ends, and quickly draw them apart to create a loud snap. That sound foretold the cold leather across my nude buttocks. I would cry and plead and beg, but it didn't do any good. Instead, he would coldly say, "I'll give you something to cry about," and proceed to hit me. It felt like the sting of 100 bees. Now, Mom was no less culpable. She once told me that she had broken many wooden spoons across my backside when I misbehaved. It became somewhat of a joke as I grew older, but in truth, it was physical abuse, plain and simple. School, which should have been a haven, was no less threatening. Like social studies, math, and gym class, corporal punishment was an institution of the educational system in the 1970s. The paddle proved it. Made of oak, its veneer was broken only by a series of large holes designed to reduce wind resistance and inflict the most pain. It hung silently in the principal's office like a neon danger sign. And although I never experienced it, I knew friends who had. Like my father's belt, the paddle was always ready to give me something to cry about. The physical threats diminished during my high school and early adult years, but the pain never did. Instead, the belt and the paddle were replaced by words. When I made mistakes, I was yelled at, chastised, ignored, or belittled. Worse yet, I was told that I disappointed people, made bad decisions, and only thought about myself. So I began to believe that any mistake or error in judgment would inevitably lead to a negative consequence. So, to feel safe, I had to become someone I was not, a people pleasing perfectionist. As a people pleaser, I was guided by the whims of others, so strongly influenced by outside circumstance that my life was no longer my own. I would say yes when I meant no, excessively apologized, felt responsible for the feelings of others, and absolutely hated it when people were angry with me. I never admitted when my feelings were hurt or when I was suffering. In fact, I mastered the belief that if I expressed emotional or physical pain, it would only lead to more suffering or ridicule. And as a male, to express sadness, discomfort, fear, or even love was seen as weak, effeminate, and cowardly. And I could have none of that. My personality changed. Instead of exercising my ubiquitous imagination and childlike joy to discover my own path, as I was prone to do, I would try to please others by being perfect. This meant cheating on exams to hide my educational deficiencies, lie when I broke things, and be the first to break up a relationship. When things did not go my way, I would argue, yell, or fight, not because of any narcissistic need to control, but because I feared I would make a mistake and suffer the pain that would inevitably follow. It became a repulsive emotional addiction to anger, an addiction from which I am only now beginning to recover. I truly believed that if I met the needs of others and executed my life in a flawless manner, they would be happy with me. Never once did it cross my mind that this disordered belief system would not only yield a life of torment, but lead me to seriously consider the value of my own life. Part 2, The Knife. Our courtship, if you could call it that, lasted a mere month. I was living with my mother at the time, having recently transitioned from California to New York for work. With no leases to break or mortgages to pay, it was easy for me to move in with Janet and her children. Now, I admit I had misgivings from day one because she had asked me to hide all my personal effects at the bottom of the wardrobe closet. She explained that if social services learned that she had a roommate, her checks would stop and she would be rendered homeless. Although I wasn't comfortable as her accomplice, I acquiesced. It made her happy, and I hid anything that would suggest I was living in her apartment. I quickly rinsed and dried coffee cups, buried my dirty buried my dirty laundry under hers, and ensured my shoes vanished at the back of the coat closet as soon as they came off my feet. I ceased all hobbies, stopped reading books, and stored family photographs. I even parked my car far away from the apartment and left my work clothes at work to avoid suspicion. And it was easy at first, but as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel like a shadow. I told myself that I was doing it for love, but the truth was, I was doing it because I was afraid. I felt that if I didn't live up to her expectations, that if I made a mistake, it would lead to our undoing, and that was an unbearable thought. So, to solve the problem for the both of us, I asked Janet to marry me. Although I continued to live in the back of her closet, I had hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt invigorated, excited, and seen. In my mind, by agreeing to marry me, she recognized my value. I decided that my hiding in the shadows was simply an anomaly, a minor bump in the road to happiness. I was wrong. A few weeks into our engagement, she confided to me that she had recently slept with her prior boyfriend to make sure that I was the right man for her. Janet's betrayal cut deep, but I chose to do nothing. I was so programmed to please others that I could not bear to disappoint her or her children, who by this time I had grown to think of as my own. It didn't matter that she was unfaithful. It only mattered that she was happy with me. So I accepted her apology, and we were married a few weeks later. For the next year and a half, I struggled to find my way. Believing that my happiness was based entirely on hers, I did whatever was asked, and then some. I needed to please her. So I agreed so I agreed to bathe and dress the children each day, drive them to daycare each morning, and pick them up every afternoon, knowing perfectly well that she could do it herself. I even agreed to purchase expensive items, knowing that money was limited, even taking on a second job to cover the added expenses. I never once asked her to work because I did not want her to think I was incapable of providing for her and her children. All this, I thought, and she is still communicating with her lover. We're just good friends, she would say. And I believed her, at least for a little while. Over time, the conversations became lengthier and more intimate, and she would meet him periodically. And for me, it was not the potential infidelity I worried about, but rather her constant comparison between the two of us. When she highlighted my shortcomings and imperfections, I felt guilty for not meeting her expectations. And lacking an appropriate emotional vocabulary, I allowed my anger to consume me. Is this what you want? I screamed as I ripped the knife from the kitchen drawer. You see, I had reached a breaking point. The sudden explosion of spoons and forks startled her, and she backed away. Resting the cool blade upon my wrist, I pressed it deep into my flesh. I could feel its tiny serrations hovering dangerously close to my veins. Don't you see how much I've sacrificed for you? I cried. Fear and confusion danced in Janet's eyes. I wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. In that moment, I relished her anguish because it reflected exactly how I was feeling. Don't do this. What the hell do you care? I snapped, pushing the knife deeper into my skin. And for a split second, I could see myself drawing the blade hard and fast. I could see the blood, hear the screams, and feel the hands of the paramedics as they tried to save my life. But I did not act. Instead, my people-pleasing behaviors took charge once again. As strange as it sounds, despite feeling utterly lost and incredibly sad, the only reason I did not take my life that day was because I did not want to disappoint other people. Doing so was literally worse than death. I dropped the knife and slid to the floor weeping. I was heartbroken, not from regret or embarrassment, but from failing to meet my own high standards. I simply could not fathom how I could have been so wrong about everything, and it hurt. A few days later, Janet urged me to attend anger management classes. Feeling that if I refused, she would leave me, I agreed. While the 10-week course did provide some relief in terms of how best to address my temper, it did nothing to resolve the underlying fear that I now knew permeated every aspect of my life. No matter what I did, it was never going to be good enough. Still, I had hope. Upon completing the course, I imagined life would improve, but it did not. Her behaviors continued, my behaviors continued, and within 6 months, I filed for divorce. Our marriage lasted for less than 2 years. Thank you guys for listening to the first part of my chapter. And if you'd like to send me some comments or if you want to engage in conversation, I'm available. So I will be reading part 2 tomorrow at 7 p.m. right here on Facebook and YouTube. And I hope you get a chance to listen. Thank you guys and have a good night.